Today we have two speakers who are going to talk about their book, Socialism Sucks. Two economists drink their way through the unfree world. Ben Powell is the director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech. He received his PhD in economics from George Mason University. And by the way, if you're interested in pursuing a PhD, Texas Tech's got a great program. You'll come out actually really knowing economics. You won't have to know so much math. You still have to know a lot of math, but you'll learn some economics. You should check it out. And Bob Lawson's a clinical professor of economics, Jerome M. Fullwinder Centennial Chair in Economic Freedom and director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom in the Cox School of Business at some school that beat us this week in football, and Southern Methodist. He earned his PhD in economics from Florida State, which we will beat when we play them, so that'll be okay, because that's his big school that he really likes. And he's the main author of the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And this index is really a great index because study after study has shown that when citizens of a country have more economic freedom, they're better off in almost every possible measure you can think of about well-being. So economic freedom allows you to better serve your fellow man through business and thus enhance human flourishing. So this is how we make people better off. So go out and do good business. So anyhow, I think you have a much better understanding of all this when Bob and Ben give their presentation, and we will take questions at the end of their presentation. Go up to the microphones there and ask your questions. So anyhow, Ben and Bob, thanks for coming.
All right. Hey, so very pleased to be here. Steve, thanks so much for having us back. Bob and I came here and we talked about this book when it first came out in 2019. And I'm pleased to say that other than Steve and Donna, I'm not sure I recognize anybody in the audience, which is good because 5 years ago they all should have graduated. If not, and you're here a second time, well, maybe you'll get it this time. But great to be back here. And this was a really different project for Bob and I. As Steve mentioned, he co-authors the Economic Freedom of the World annual report. Both of us have written scores, hundreds of boring academic studies. And this project was a little bit different. And it kind of started two ways. One way was Bob messaged me and he's like, hey, let's go to Cuba and hang out for a week. And I mentioned this to my wife and she's like, you're not just going and getting drunk on vacation with Bob for a week in Cuba. And I'm like, no, it's going to be research. And that all of a sudden made it true. And I was like, Bob, I got this idea. Maybe we could write a book. I don't know if we can write this style book, but let's go get drunk in Cuba for the week, like my wife said, and we'll write it up, but like for normal people and give it to the non-academics and see what they think of this. And if it works, maybe we can build a book around it. And that passed the smell test with both wives. That was one motivation. The other motivation was people like this esteemed academic, I think, Michael Moore and others, who in 2016 were pointing out that young people are attracted to socialism more than capitalism in the United States. And this is on the heels, too, of the 2016 election, right, where Bernie Sanders made a legit run in the Democratic Party in the primary to become the presidential candidate while saying that he's a democratic socialist. Also around this same time, 2017, the New York Times did a year-long feature every week on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution of a socialist column. And of these 52 columns, there were maybe 2 or 3 that mentioned the mass human atrocities committed by socialist regimes in the 20th century. Instead, and maybe 1 on the economic stagnation of these systems, instead you got columns like, why women had better sex under socialism, which, even if true, how you balance that against tens of millions of dead bodies, I'm not quite sure. But the world seemed to be shifting in the socialist direction, and Bob and I wanted to write a book that people, unlike the academic articles he writes, would actually read. So that's what we were trying to do with this book. So here's the little tour we're going to go on tonight. So this follows the outline of the book. I'll talk very briefly about Sweden and then turn it over to Bob to talk about Venezuela. We'll go to Cuba, then North Korea, China, Russia, and Ukraine, which we did before the war had started there. And then Georgia, the former Soviet Republic, and its reforms, and then we'll come back to the USSA, where Bob and I attended the largest socialist gathering in the United States to try to learn from the young commies of what it exactly is that they are thinking. So first, let's just get some clarity here of what socialism is. Socialism meant something to Marx, it meant something to Lenin, it's meant something to economists who have studied this topic for 20 years. And it seems like there's a lot of confusion among young people about what it is. Socialism means abolishing private property in the major factors of production and replacing it with some form of collective ownership. For any large society, this usually means state ownership of the means of production. That is socialism. So when you listen to Bernie Sanders say something like, oh, I want democratic socialism in the United States, like Sweden, like Norway, no. And for that matter, when you watch Fox News and they say, we're going to be socialists like Sweden and Norway, also no. So Sweden and Norway, so first chapter, not socialism, Sweden, private property in the means of production is the norm there. Nokia is a private company. The hotels, the restaurants, these are privately owned. Now, does Sweden have a big welfare state? Yeah. They're not a perfect free market economy. They tax a lot. They regulate their labor markets a bit. But they have really good protection of private property, good freedom to trade internationally, low levels of business regulation. Overall, so Bob, as mentioned in his introduction, measures this economic freedom of the world. Sweden's in the top quarter of countries of most economically free, i.e. most capitalist, with a big welfare state. Are there consequences to a big welfare state? Sure. So if you dial back to like 1950, Sweden, I think, was the 4th richest country in the world at that point. Now, they had been dirt poor in the mid-1800s. They had laissez-faire reforms, including by an anti-prohibitionist, and they grew rapidly for a century. Got to be about the 4th wealthiest country in the world. Started putting in a big welfare state. What happened? Growth slowed, but they weren't impoverished. They just stopped growing as rapidly. Now they're in the bottom half of OECD, the club of rich countries, bottom half of them in income, because there's trade-offs. Now, I personally would rather see more economic growth and less welfare state, but reasonable people might disagree about the trade-offs between these. That's very different than thinking about the trade-offs between socialism and capitalism. The trade-offs between socialism and capitalism are much worse, and I'll trade it off to Bob right now to start talking about some of that in Venezuela.
Okay, so we were a little too lazy to go into Venezuela. They need visas, and we were too lazy to apply. So we went to Colombia and then flew to a town called Cucuta. Cucuta is on the border of Venezuela and Colombia. And it turns out it's a really good place to go if you want to learn something about the current situation, or the situation at the time in Venezuela. And you can see there's a bridge here. And every day when we were there, and I think it's still happening, tens of thousands of people, with no exaggeration, cross by foot that's closed to vehicle traffic. And these are Venezuelans crossing the border on foot to go across to the Colombian side to buy food, to buy groceries. Here's a little tienda. There's a little sort of town that's developed right there on the border. And you can see there's rice beans, diapers, shampoo, aspirin. They're just buying food and things. And why are they driving all the way to the border? In many cases, halfway across the country, because there was increasing scarcity in Venezuela. Venezuela went socialist. They nationalized the major means of production, of course, most famously the oil industry, but not just the oil industry, large agricultural concerns, manufacturing, factories, hotels, things like that. So the country has gone more or less full socialist, and they have price controls and shortages developed. This is Econ 101 stuff. And so in Venezuela, again, you see the people coming across. There are a couple really interesting things about this trip. There's hyperinflation in Venezuela because the government doesn't have any money, and so they print it, and they're printing it like crazy. We traded one $20 US $20 bill, and we got a stack of 100 bolivars? I think it was only 100. It was the largest note. A stack, so this is $20. Okay, so if you wanted to buy, say, a car, you would need essentially a car's worth of cash to buy a car. And in fact, the people coming in, many of them are coming in with roller bags and to buy food and groceries and take them back to Venezuela. But when they came into the countries, the roller bags are heavy. You could tell they had something in them. Well, they have cash. So they have suitcases of cash coming in. They trade all of these bolívares for a tiny amount of Colombian pesos. They buy the rice and beans and aspirin and sugar and shampoo and all the things they want to buy. They fill their same suitcases up with that, and they go back across the border. We talked to one couple, and I think Ben and I both think of all the travels, the most memorable moment was Ana Maria and Paulo. And they had driven from Ciudad Bolivar, which is a city on the other side, sort of towards the Brazilian side of the country, Guyana, way over on the other side. So it was a 3-day trip, one way. And they were middle-class people. They had a car. They weren't peasants. They were, had some means. I think Paulo said he worked in a hotel back in his home city. But they drove 3 days to Cucuta, to buy food and groceries, and then it was going to be 3 days back. Can you imagine how bad would your life have to be? Like, how dystopic would your existence have to be for you to think it's a great idea to get in your car in Louisville and drive to Vancouver for a grocery run, which is the equivalent of more or less what these people did. And it really kind of struck me as how horrible. And I think they had a child. They mentioned they had a child, and they left the child at home with relatives. And it's just like, it's a terrifying thought, to try to take a dangerous trip across the country just to buy food. So that's the kind of scenario. One of the really interesting things about Venezuelan socialism, and it makes it different than all the other socialisms that I can think of, is that it was, at least initially, democratic socialism. Ben mentioned that Bernie Sanders likes to put the adjective democratic in front of socialism. And Venezuela started out democratic. Hugo Chavez, the socialist leader, originally he was elected in a free and fair election. They enacted their socialist policies. The economy fell apart, as economies tend to do under socialism. And what would happen today if Venezuela had a free and fair election? Well, we don't actually, that's not a hypothetical. We know what would happen. They would vote, now it's Maduro, Chavez died, so Maduro's the current leader. They would vote the rascals out. They would vote the socialists out of power. So Venezuela just had an election. You might recall just a month or so ago, a couple months ago. Was it free and fair? No, unfortunately it was not. It was a stolen election. All observers believe that the opposition candidates won that election. Maduro declared himself president, and he's still president. So it started out democratic socialism, but now it's just socialism. It's not democratic anymore. And we think that's actually causal. We think that's not a random thing. Most socialisms didn't even start democratic. And in fact, there's one we'll talk about. Ben, you can talk about Cuba, the least,
Yeah, you know what, Bob? You and I get forgetful.
What did we forget?
Because there's a subtitle of the book, too. 2 economists drink their way through the unfree world. And I totally forgot to mention this in the context of Sweden, and you did in Venezuela. So when the initial reviewers were looking at the book, the subtitle wasn't 2 economists drink their way. It was like 2 economists travel the unfree world. And then we started getting cover images from the publisher that all had beer on it. And we're like, this was just an honest account of our travels. And some people's commentary then in reviewing the manuscript, like, yeah, you should take that out. It's kind of childish. And then this other guy that we're friends with, Matt Kibbe, he's like, oh no, just lean into it, man. It's a metaphor. It speaks to the whole thing. So like in Sweden, like actually we had Belgian beer just very near Belgium that was delicious. But it cost a freaking fortune because they tax the hell out of everything in Sweden because they have a big welfare state. In Venezuela,
Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention they have actually run out of beer because the government doesn't give them foreign exchange so that they can buy enough hops and barley.
if I were a socialist dictator, toilet paper, beer. These are the 2 things that I would make sure we don't run out of. All right, so Cuba. So this is the best place to walk around and see a functioning socialist economy. Our wives gave us a rule when we started this book that we weren't allowed to get imprisoned or killed. Jailed is okay because that's temporary. But so that's why we kind of skirted it with Cucuta, Colombia, and briefly went into Venezuela illegally, but not for very long. He'll tell you about North Korea later. Cuba, it's safe, you can walk around, you can travel the island, and you can see the mundane transactions of a socialist economy better than anywhere else in the world today. And I'll start with this example of where we stayed at the Hotel Trinton in a suburb of Havana, oceanfront resort, supposedly with a pool. And you can see the picture in the top left that's in the lobby of the hotel from when it opened, with this kind of Soviet architecture, except vertical rather than horizontal, as you see in much of Eastern Europe leftovers. And it was not quite that nice by the time we got there, and we weren't trying to sandbag this. Bob actually had a friend who recommended this hotel to us. You can see its dingier appearance here and some of the broken windows and such, and also there's 4 elevators for this tall building. 3 of them are out of service. You can see part of that going across right there. And in fact, when we got there, booking a hotel in Cuba is not easy since they don't take US credit cards, but you give it to a British company, pay them money, and then show up there, and then they don't have your reservation, which you solve, well, I solve by drinking beers in the lobby while he argues with them and eventually gives them more money, and then we have a hotel room. And have you all stayed in a hotel where like you didn't have hot water in the morning because everybody was using hot water at the same time? Yeah. Ever stayed in a hotel where you don't have water in the morning? This hotel accomplished that. Now, it turns out when you pay musicians and plumbers the same amount because you're a socialist economy, you get lots of clogged pipes and a lot of music, because music's more fun to do than plumbing. This is a look inside the rooms. Now, we didn't stay at just this one. We also stayed at Hotel Carib in central Havana, downtown near the seat of government. This is pictures from a couple of them. You can see the missing bathroom towels, the hole in the shower, the glass that came out of the sanitary bag, but clearly is dirty. My personal favorite's the toilet seat. If you look closely, there's a missing bolt. So if you sit on the toilet seat, you just kind of like slide across, which is convenient because if you make a mess, they left you the previous guest's soap that you could use to clean up. Now, let's play a little game. This game is called The Price is Wrong. This is Cuba. You want to guess what either of these hotel rooms cost? Anybody?
$500.
So you're right in that either guess really high or really low, because the price is going to be wrong. So it's not $500.
20.
Now we're getting closer. It was about $65, $70, I think, for each of these hotel rooms. And the second one, by the way, we had gone and we had stayed in some private places, which I'll tell you about in just a sec. We'd come back from a long, hot, sweaty ride from Trinidad. Had stopped at a restaurant to eat in central Havana, and there's a hotel next door. And Bob's like, oh, there's a hotel right next door. I'm like, we can't stay there if it's as shitty as the other one. He's like, all right, I'll check it out. I think the air conditioning just tricked him, because that's the one with the toilet seat thing. Anyway, how about this? So this is Casa Particular. So in the scale of like 1 to 10 of pure socialism, pure capitalism, no country in the world today conforms exactly to any one of these. Probably the closest to pure socialism we ever saw was either Russia during the period of war communism under Lenin in 1917 to 21, or the Great Leap Forward in China under Mao from 57 to, let's say, 61. Cuba is on the socialist end of the spectrum now, but within your own apartments, you have a property right, sort of, in that you can rent it out to other people for a profit. So this is a flat in downtown central Havana, right off the Malecón, which we joked was like bad economics. And it's a 2-bedroom place. That one is, that's one of the bedrooms. That's a different one down in Trinidad. And unlike we rented the first one on Airbnb, which again, impressive because your credit cards don't work, but it turns out everybody in Cuba has a relative in Miami. So you just pay the relative in Miami, they call their friend in Cuba, and then you have a reservation. And they actually meet you there on time. So that one had a kitchen, a bathroom with both running water and warm water. Guess the price?
40.
Turns out about 60, about the same as the hotel, except they had our reservation and it was nice. This is the same service being provided, accommodation. This is not like an informational failure. This is just incentives. In one place, no one gives a shit because they don't make a profit by serving customers. In the other, they earn a little bit more meager income, make themselves a little bit better off. What do? They improve the capital asset and then try to make more money renting it to it. This is the power of private incentives versus markets versus government planners in a hotel where nobody cares. The other one, that was $25 a night. And it had a full bar downstairs. That was in Trinidad. We went into a bar, we had our bags with us. The waitress is like, oh, you want to rent upstairs? And that one, I went up and checked out. I was like, oh, good. And I was like, hey, what's your reservation price? She's like, $50. She's like, 25. I'm like, sold. Plus, I got a full bar downstairs. He doesn't drink as late at night as I do, so I'm like, perfect. All right, last thing here before I'll hand it over to Bob again. This is a commercial street on the top left corner in central Havana. What's missing in this picture? Okay, cars. I'll let Bob talk about cars in a minute, but this is actually a pedestrian street. Signs. There's no signs. So like the way that he and I work is like we walk around and then we drink a little, and then we walk around some more and drink a little. It's actually hard to do without signs because you get to a corner and you're like, huh, is there a place that has a bar down there? I don't know. How do you find out? You walk down there and you look in the windows. Then you find a place. This is not poverty. So this is like Bob and I have each been to more than 50 countries. Plenty of poor countries. Poor countries have signs. Why doesn't a socialist country have signs? Because they don't want your business. No one cares. You don't have to advertise to bring people in. In fact, customers are a mild inconvenience. Top right, that's a well-stocked convenience store. I could show you pictures of poorly stocked convenience stores. That's a well-stocked one. What's wrong with that picture?
It doesn't look that well-stocked.
Oh, it's well-stocked. That's lots of stuff, dude. It's all the same thing, whoever said that over here. There's maybe 24 distinct items. They have lots of each of them, but there's no variety. When Bernie Sanders says, capitalism gives us 17 types of deodorants, who needs 17 types of deodorants? Most people here, yeah, why do we need that? I only use one deodorant, which I think we probably have more than 17 types of deodorant in this room, thankfully. But actually, we value variety. There was one type of cola in this store. I called it Commie Cola, that wasn't its real name. But Cuba in beer has two types of beer, Bucanero and Cristal. They're both like around 5% alcohol, and they taste like a Budweiser that you've left out in the sun for maybe a little bit too long. There's no variety, but we like variety. Just here on the Louisville campus, I picked up a Pollyanna, a German Oktoberfest beer. I could have picked up what's the atomic that's made by a Louisville graduate? What? Hoptomica. Hoptomica. The variety of beer that we have in a capitalist country is amazing. And it's delicious. My wife thinks that we wrote this book just so I could drink while we give talks. She might be right. So I'm going to skip over the restaurants, Bob, in the sake of time. Why don't you tell them a little bit about cars and other things while I'm quenching my thirst.
So Ben and I are, where are the cars? There's the cars. Ben and I are car guys. I've got a few classic cars. Ben's got an old Corvette. And you know, when you first get to Cuba, you've all heard about the old 50s American cars. And at first you're like, it's pretty cool. I'm in a 56 Plymouth. How neat is this? And then you realize, yeah, the Detroit motor blew up sometime in the 70s, and it's now got a tractor engine in it, and the suspension is being held together with bubble gum and popsicle sticks. And don't even ask about air conditioning. If it ever had it, it doesn't now. But the thing about socialism is socialism's weird. And Cuban socialism is especially weird. And we almost named this chapter The Price is Wrong instead of The Price is Right, because the prices are just messed up. It's not just hotel prices. In the background there, I think it's a 56 Chevy, the red car. In American classic car markets, that would be a barn find. It's a parts car. You could pick it up for a few grand, a couple grand. It's worthless. And in the condition, now if you had a restored 56 Chevy, it's worth tens of thousands, but in that condition, in the American market, it's worth almost nothing. And what do you think that red car sells for in Cuba? Bear in mind, Cubans are very poor. Income statistics in Cuba are kind of messed up, but they probably make somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000 per person on average. They're poor. What do you think that red car sells for? Go high or go low? $15,000 to $18,000. Now, relative to income, if the average income, let's say, is $2,000, that's 6 times the average person's income. Right? It's crazy. Doesn't make any sense. Now, it's going to get much worse, because right there in the foreground, I think it's a 1991 Renault. Now, a 1991 Renault was a piece of junk the day it was built. Now, 30 years later, in Cuba, what's the value of a 1991 Renault?
10K.
In America?
Oh, in America, $500.
The zero. I don't even think it has a value. Like the car dealer would say, he'd cost if you found one on a used car lot in Louisville, they would just like, here, take the keys, man, get it off my lot.
Do they even let you donate it to charity?
Exactly. Yeah, right. So I mean, this thing, $35,000. Because it might still have working air conditioning, and that alone is going to be worth a lot in Cuba. It's hot there. So the prices are terrible. Why are these prices so high? You see this guy, this gentleman here, he's clearly though, I mean, he look at it, he's like, my car. Well, of course he is. I mean, he's got an Aston Martin in Cuban terms. He has a car that is 17 times the average income. Like in America, that would be multiple hundreds of thousands of dollar vehicle relative to our incomes. But one of the reasons why the cars are so expensive is 2 reasons. One is the Cuban government. This is not the U.S. embargo. We take a stance against the U.S. embargo in the book because it hasn't worked and it hurts people. But the reason for this is the Cubans won't let imported cars come in. Like if you could import a $10,000 Toyota Corolla, you could blow those cars. I mean, no one's going to buy that white car for $35,000 if someone could buy a $10,000 Corolla. You can buy a $10,000 used Corolla anywhere in here in town, right? So the Cubans won't let cars come in. So the supply of cars has just dwindled to almost nothing. And even though they're poor, supply and demand does its thing. You shift that supply curve to the left, prices go up. So that's the main reason. The other reason is there are a few ways to make money outside of the socialist state economy. One of them is to run a casa particulare or a private restaurant, but another way is he's a taxi. He doesn't say taxi, he doesn't have to say taxi. Anyone who has a car is for hire. And it's actually very expensive because there's so few cars. It costs me more to travel around Havana than New York City. You know, just a mile ride is like he wants $20 or something. But all of the profits that he earns as a taxi driver in a country with very few cars, he makes a good income, but that capitalizes into the price of the car, right? So the asset capitalizes all that. That's why the prices are so high. All right, let me, you want me to go on Korea, right? Yeah. So very quickly, wives said we couldn't get murdered or imprisoned, so we didn't go into North Korea. We flew to the city of Dandong, which is on the Chinese North Korean border. So this is on the Yalu River, if you know your Korean War history. This is right where a lot of action happened during the war. It's a river, it's not obviously mined. You could swim across it. There's guard towers, like there's a guard tower right here on the North Korean side. And on the other side, you can see things. You've all seen this satellite photo probably. This is not made up because we actually arrived in Dandong. Dandong is right here. That's the city on the Chinese side. It's a major city, 9 million people or something. Millions and millions of people. Very large city, but by Chinese standards, just a city. And so right there, all those lights, and then across the border, when we arrived and we looked across the river, everything in the top left, on that top left picture, everything in the top left is North Korea. But when we arrived and we looked across the river, it's just nothing over there. Now, supposedly there's hundreds of thousands of North Koreans living on this city on the other side of the river, but there's no evidence at night that there's anyone living over there. They're living in complete darkness. So that satellite photo is not just some kind of, it's not a Photoshop. It's actually true that at night there are no lights in North Korea. Plenty of lights on the Chinese side. So everything in the, these are the same photos, the top left.
See the bridge.
And you can see the bridge that is lit up. So this is all China in the foreground, but the background, you can see there's a lot of stuff going on over there. But at night it's utterly dark. And And so in the book, we talk a lot about the split of the Korean Peninsula. We did go to South Korea for the trip too, and talk about the history of how, and we have sort of a natural experiment. One side with more or less the same culture. Actually, the North Korean side was the richer side before the war, and the South Koreans were the poor farmers. But we had this sort of natural experiment where one side of the peninsula, one side of the nation went socialist, the other side went something more like capitalist. And of course, the history speaks clearly as to what has happened in both of these places. I forget the drill here.
Yeah,
we haven't done this in a minute.
This is the part of the talk where I like to drink beer more than I like to
Did
talk.
you open mine?
Yeah, I opened yours.
thank
I
you.
did a man thing for you. You're all
Thank
right.
you.
And actually, Professor Goman met us in Korea on this trip, smoking a cigar outside of a Belgian beer bar in North Korea. All right, so I'll do the China one real quick. So China was real socialism under Mao after the revolution from 47 to roughly the mid-1970s. They collectivized lots of the means of production. During the Great Leap Forward, it was one of the greatest collectivizations in human history. Probably, I said earlier, competing with war communism in the early Soviet Union. And the result was about 40 million excess deaths. Numbers still being estimated because the records are not clear, but probably the greatest mass unnecessary death in human history under Mao. Now, that's not China today. China today is a mess in a different way. But starting in 1978, Deng Xiaoping starts reforming the economy, allowing town and village enterprises. A lot of the reform is done on the local level and later sanctioned higher up. And they transitioned from a country where there was essentially very little private property in anything to the bulk of Chinese economic activity today is governed by market forces. It's not a free market economy by any means. It's in the bottom half of Bob's index. But it would be a mistake to call it a socialist economy. It's a crony capitalist economy that is run by a communist political party that maintains its political control. Its reform, in fact, and change of economic freedom, of the move from socialism to capitalism, it's the biggest reformer in Asia from 1980 through 2010. It's just after Xi becomes president in 2012, basically China stops reforming. They kind of flatline after that. And meanwhile, civil freedoms, which were never a thing in China, are actually being more repressed, and it's being more asserted over Hong Kong. And Bob and I experienced just a little bit of this when we were in China for this trip. We were in Beijing and Shanghai, and actually the pictures there, by the way, in terms of economic freedom and development, this is Shanghai in 1991. This is the Pudong district across the river, which was the slum. That's the picture looking across the river in 2017 when we were there. The iconic skyline of Shanghai was the slum. That's a special economic zone that has more economic freedom than other areas of China. Average incomes today over $22,000 there from being a poor slum a generation ago. But the political party there and its repression, we were invited to speak at a conference. Actually, it was kind of spontaneous. When we were in Korea, someone else from China knew we were coming there, and they said, "We're having a conference on Ayn Rand and Austrian economics in Beijing. Would you guys like to speak at it?" And I was like, "Hell yeah." And it was like a kilometer or two from Tiananmen Square. We're like, this is cool. It was like maybe, I don't know, 30 Chinese academics, a dozen graduate students or something like that. And the next morning we wake up and we were going to do something else, but we had a message from one of our friends. It was like, "I hope you're not at day 2 of the conference. Chinese government has hired thugs to beat people up. Building is locked. Police trying to arrest people. Founder of the institute is under house arrest." Because talking about those ideas during the Belt and Road Initiative conference was not cool in Beijing. So while it's made a lot of progress on economic freedoms, it's still obviously very politically unfree. Now I get to drink beer again.
Yeah. So we also went to the Soviet Union. Former Soviet Union, went to Russia and Ukraine, Moscow and Kiev. If you've the Soviet Union, it's been so long now. It's been 30 years, but the Soviet Union was sometimes called a shortage economy. And by that, it meant almost everything was in short supply. And when things are when you have shortages, lines form, right? You end up having to wait in line for things. And lines were such a common thing. Every day, Soviet citizens would have to wait in line. And it was so common, like there'd be a line, and you'd just get in the line. And then you tap the guy in front, and it's like, what are we waiting for? Because, I mean, there must be something worth getting, right? And, like maybe today we can get some butter. Butter's coming today, maybe. So hopefully they don't run out of the butter before before you get to the front of the line. So waiting in line is very common, and we talk, in the chapter we talk a lot about the Soviet experience and how, those sorts of things. But there's no lines today in Moscow because they're not really a socialist economy anymore. It's kind of a crony capitalist economy, like it's even worse than China. But there is one line, and I think it's appropriate. This is the line to see Lenin's tomb. And they don't charge for it, and so a line forms every day, and a tourist and local, Russian tourists and Western tourists, people from all over the world, wait in this long line. And I thought that was the most appropriate way to remember Soviet socialism, was to have a line to wait for to see Lenin's body. And I hope they never charge. Hope the line's always there, because that's really the best memory of Soviet socialism. It isn't Lenin's body; it's the line to get in to see Lenin's body. That's the best way to remember what that economy was really all about. Let's talk about Georgia as well. Now, Georgia also was a former Soviet republic. The Georgians, again, alcohol became a metaphor, right? In Cuba, they only have two types. In Venezuela, they've run out. We had North Korean beer, absolutely toxic. I can't even, words don't exist for how the taste. I think I can, it was years ago, I still can taste it, I think. It's still in my head. It was truly, truly awful. But we had good beers in China and good beers in Kiev, because they're not really socialist anymore. They're moving somewhere elsewhere. Well, Georgia also has moved very far away from its socialist days when they were part of the Soviet Union. But here the metaphor changes to wine, not beer, because Georgians invented wine. Archaeologists believe that Georgia was cultivating wine 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BC. It's the oldest known cultivation of wine in the world. The Georgians are extraordinarily proud of their wine heritage. Every village has multiple varieties that don't exist on, like the next village has got it completely, they've got vines that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. So they have this whole winemaking culture. And in Soviet times, Soviet Union bureaucrats were not morons. They knew that Georgians were good at making wine. So in the Soviet central planning days, they said, Georgia, you guys make the wine for all the Soviet Union. You guys can do that. But they imported French, like Merlot and Chardonnay grapes. They planted massive acreages of these, and they made tons or billions of barrels of really, really, really bad Merlot and Chardonnay, and they shipped it all over the Soviet Union. So if you were a Soviet citizen in Moscow or Leningrad or anywhere else throughout the whole Soviet sphere, you were probably drinking Georgian wine a lot of the time, because that was the center place for where the Soviets decided the wine would be made. Of course, it was all crap. It was terrible. Fast forward, 1991, Georgians declare independence. We're out of the Soviet Union. Who wants to buy Georgian Merlot? No one wants to buy Merlot, period, much less Georgian Merlot. So the Georgians now are bringing back their wines. And it's become one of the success stories for the country. They've moved very far towards economic freedom. On my index, they're definitely in the top 25%, top quarter. There's like in the top 20 of the whole world. So the Georgians are now a huge success story on revitalizing their ancient wine heritage. And you can go there, you can taste varieties that don't exist anywhere else in the world. They have a winemaking style that's quite primitive. Basically, you throw all the grapes in a clay pot, you bury the clay pot, you wait a while, you dig up the pot, and you have wine. It's none of this fancy stainless steel stuff that you see in modern wineries. It's very primitive. But the wines come out very different. Because it's that old, more primitive style, the wines come out tasting very, very different. In fact, the white wines that are done in the old Georgian style come out kind of an amber color, almost like a beer color. It's very different than a normal white wine that you're familiar with. So again, using the metaphor. In Soviet times, the Georgians made wine, but it was terrible wine. But post-Soviet times, after they got rid of their socialism, the wine's gotten good again. And so the alcohol became a metaphor for the operation of the entire economy. And I think Ben's going to take us to Chicago.
And wrap it up here in the last couple minutes. So come back to the USSA in Chicago, the biggest socialist gathering in the United States, and Bob and I totally didn't fit in there. And we didn't even wear blue blazers. Actually, he wore his Cincinnati Reds hat, which had a little bit of an irony. I don't think people really picked up on that. But what was different is actually there was nobody our age there. People in their 40s and 50s didn't exist. You had people who were over 70 years old, ex-hippies, and you had 35 and younger young people who were attracted to socialism. And we weren't there to argue with anybody. We were just trying to understand what attracts you to socialism. And we would ask and talk to different ones. And basically, I think there's kind of three groups that were there, or three general characterizations. One was young people who said, well, I favor democratic socialism, not understanding the trade-off. If you don't have economic freedom, it's really hard, if not impossible, to have serious political and civil freedoms, because once you centralize economic control, you centralize the power to oppress dissent, which means you can't be a healthy democracy. There's that group. And some of them were more sophisticated, and some of them were just simply Bernie Sanders types who thought Sweden was socialism. Then there was I see injustices in the United States and other parts of the developed world, be it racism, immigration issues, sex issues, gay and lesbian issues, pick whichever political issue it was, and I see oppression. And I was told socialism was against oppression and for human flourishing, therefore I'm with socialists. And you ask them, so you think nationalizing Walmart will help with gay rights, immigrant rights, black lives? Well, I don't think about socialism like that. I'm like, oh, well, actually socialism means something like this. And by the way, it works out really bad for minority interest under socialism most of the time. And then third, and this was the minority of the group, were what I'd call the tankies. They're the people who meant authoritarian socialism and would like to impose it on the world. But that wasn't the norm. I would say that second group is the biggest, and that means there's a messaging issue for those people who believe in freedom and free enterprise, and that we have to do a better job. In fact, Bob and I actually, for a lot of the things that they talked about as issues in the United States and other places, we actually agree with them that they are issues that should be addressed. But for the most part, we think more freedom and more free enterprise are better ways to solve women's issues, migrant issues, anti-war issues, a whole bunch of things that aren't socialism. But instead of people who would be perceived to be on the right saying, oh no, you kids don't get it, you actually need to engage with them better and say, oh, I appreciate those problems too. Here's how freedom is a better way to address it. And to wrap up on the beer metaphor, the Hilton Hotel that was hosting this conference understood its market. This is Revolution IPA Brewing Company from Illinois. It's the largest independently owned brewery in Illinois at the time, and all of their beer has commie logos. This is a green fist with a red star on it, and the hotel stocked it in the bar, and the kids were drinking it up. And the irony is that private enterprise brewery in Illinois provides a greater quality and variety of beer than all of the remaining socialist countries in the world combined. So this was a really fun project for Bob and I, and when we started this, we didn't know if we were going to have to publish with everybody's Insano home press or if it would do well, but we actually made it into the top 5 overall on Amazon. We were right behind Where the Crawdads Sing. But probably more fun than that, we were simultaneously the #1 book in the socialism and communism category, because some books are more equal than others, and also the #1 book in the beer category, which is not something we set out to do, but is definitely something we're proud of. So we'll wrap up there and take whatever questions you all have. Thank you.
I think there's mics.
There's mics in the back here, so come back to the microphone and do your question.
Hello, thank you so much for a great talk. You talk a little bit about can you talk a little bit about why do you think that younger generations are or want to be socialists? Kind of what is it that you think drives them to go there?
I think socialism has a great marketing team. I mean, they really do. And there are a lot of injustices in the world. There always have been, and I fear there probably always will be, some injustices in the world. And young people are especially tuned into those injustices. I know when I was younger, I felt things more deeply than I do as an older person. And socialism comes in with this, hey, this message, this marketing message of give us the power and we'll fix that sexism. We'll fix that anti-Semitism. I mean, in early socialist movements, Jewish people were very, very commonly attracted to socialist movements because that was the only political movement that was trying to address what concerned them, which was anti-Semitism and racism or whatever. So of course, it's a lie. It's a myth and a lie. And it's a bait and a switch, right? Because every time they've gotten the power, it's not like the Soviet Union was well known for its not racist or kind police officers, right? I mean, so if you care about police injustice, for example, you don't want, socialist cops. They're worse than our cops. So that's the thing. And I think that we could do a better job, Ben alluded to this, of being more sensitive. Those by we, I mean people like me. I'm a classical liberal. I favor economic freedom and political freedom and democracy, but I favor liberalism in the old sense of that word. But I think we should be more willing to engage with these younger people who have these quite legitimate concerns about injustice and oppression. And I think for the most part, we don't do that. I'm an economist. It's like I feel weird talking that kind of language. I want to talk about supply and demand curves, but I think that's part of our problem. And they've got good marketing, we've got bad marketing. A lot of liberalism's messages though are hard messages, like, okay, there's no free lunch here. That's Tom Stoffel. There's no such thing as a free lunch. It's like a core message that we say to people. Well, that's not very fun, right? What do you mean I would like a free lunch. Free lunches are nice. So our messages are very often kind of downlifting, whereas socialist messaging is very often very uplifting. And I think it doesn't have to be that way, but we need to be more conscious of it.
Hello, my name is Mark. I am a junior in BSBA. I'm actually Latin American. I come from Panama, not Venezuela, but I have a lot of Venezuelan friends. And something that happens quite a lot down there in the South is that due to unstable politics, people and the government tend to have a capitalist economy, and the people, they stop believing in them, right? So they start voting more for leftist, for socialist politics. And a lot of that comes because there is a mishandle of the welfare part of the state, the education, health, and everything. And also when you see that the happiness index rankings, for example, Scandinavian countries, you said Sweden is not a socialism country, which I agree on, but we see that they do have like very strong welfare aspects to their systems, right? So the happiness index in the countries rank higher when free markets also have a strong welfare to back up the population. Would you say that for a strong capitalist country to stay stable, do they have to have a strong welfare aspect to it? And if so, how can we provide that as a country and keep the individual's rights to freedom and liberty?
Yeah, so I would say no, actually, that a free and growing economy where people are seeing their lots improved are a sustainable way to do this, and that, in fact, that if you look at the United States history relative to Europe in the so-called Gilded Age of the 1870s through 1910, when European countries were putting in welfare states, they weren't growing as rapidly as the United States. The United States was taking on immigrants while growing rapidly, and there wasn't a demand for the welfare state because people were seeing their lot improve. And I think that's more important. When it comes to the happiness rankings, I actually think it's all BS. Because let's do a little experiment, right? Like if I get to punch Bob Lawson in the face and Muhammad Ali was sitting here, because we're in Louisville, and I get to punch him in the face, and then I ask them each, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does that hurt? Do you think they're using the same scale? I don't. But when we say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? And then we aggregate people across countries, this is junk science as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you.
So my name is Luis. I'm from Panama as well, just like Mark. And something that was really important that I can highlight from this conversation was that you can tell the flavor about the beers and how bad they were, right? So do you think that the quality of the beers, it is fully dependent because beer enterprises have like competence in the market, you know? Because they don't have variety, so they don't have competence, and that it is equal to I can make whatever I want with whatever quality I want, and people is still gonna buy it.
So, I mean, the reason our beer is good in America is because we've got a lot of beer makers, and they have to compete for business for customers, and that competition forces them to make better quality beer and safer beer. It would be very bad if you poisoned your customers. You very quickly you'd find out. Even leaving aside safety regulations and such, you'd very quickly run out of business. So the point about socialist economies is they're state enterprises. They don't face competition. And in such an environment, you tend to not, it's not just beer though. You get bad hotels, you get bad restaurants, you get, but beer was just, for us, it was just a very useful and kind of fun, way to illustrate the point. But it's actually not so much about beer. But what you really want for better quality products that satisfy the needs of most people is a vibrant, free, and open economy where people are free to start enterprises, and they have to compete with other enterprises for the dollars of customers. That's what gets us the best stuff that we see around us.
Yeah, and I'll just add on a little bit different too. Professor Goman and I both love smoking cigars, and Cuban cigars, we didn't talk about those, and they were obviously famous worldwide. And there's certain things about the soil, the leaves, the climate that make their flavor different, how they ash different. But quality control still sucks. The number of Cuban cigars I smoke that burn really uneven compared to ones rolled in Honduras or Ecuador or Nicaragua, the quality control under socialism sucks even when you have a natural asset that is competing on the international market, but the market forces inside just don't force it the same way to be good as it could be.
Hold on, this is not made for short people. Okay. I'm from Ohio.
Yay.
Yeah.
Who day?
Yeah. You mentioned like the marketing around socialism, and you also mentioned like right at the beginning how you guys were formulating this not for an academic audience. Do you think that's part of the draw for socialism, is that a lot of it, like a lot of the capitalist arguments are like so like economically academic that people just can't understand it, but they can understand like simpler arguments that are around socialism, like, let's not be racist, stuff like that?
Short answer is yes, but I don't want to overplay that position. I mean, a lot of what economic freedom offers is hard work, delayed gratification, like you have to save and invest today, and that's hard because no one likes to save money. We all like to spend money, right? So you have to save, so invest, so we can create more capital for the future, and that's what makes us rich. All of that messaging is fundamentally hard. Like it's hard, like it's not fun. It's that no free lunch problem, right? And socialism, I mean, the fundamentals of economics don't go away when you have a socialist economy, but the socialists don't highlight those things. They essentially hide those fundamental realities, and they kind of create a sort of a land of milk and honey. We're just, we're going to have socialism, and we will, that's what the Israeli kibbutzim line was, the land of milk and honey. We're going to have, good stuff. We're going to have this blossoming and flowering of creativity and and it's a lie. It doesn't happen because you can't short circuit. Reality requires, like if you're going to have capital investment's absolutely required for economic development. Capital investment requires delayed gratification. It requires us to suffer today a little bit so we can have more in the future. And that's just a fundamentally unsexy and unfun message. We could do better at our messaging, but I don't know that we're ever going to be as good at it unless we lie.
The part of the rub here is the socialist ethos is like taking the norms of the family and acting like it's for the society, as if you can transfer those things. Like my family is a socialist enterprise. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. We love each other. We don't I have a 13-year-old boy, 14-year-old boy, and when he goes to the cabinet, like we don't charge him when he takes out snacks. We don't do transactions. But taking the norms of the family where you basically know each other's needs and preferences, and by the way, it's a consumption unit, not a productive unit, and then taking that norm and trying to transfer it to a society feels good, but it's bad social science. One, you can't ever powerize the incentives in such a way to care for each other the same way as within the family, i.e. the hotels. But then what we really didn't get into this talk is the informational problems of how you need market prices generated through competition to no relative scarcities to coordinate, and already I sound dorky with that answer, which makes the marketing hard. But I think that's part of the problem, is that it appeals to the norms of family and love when it's really the economy of unlove.
Thank you for coming, and I agree that socialism sucks, but I have a question. So it seems like socialism is really good for the environment because, for example, you showed a picture of North Korea and there's no light and assume we don't burn fossil fuels, so there's no pollution to that. So what are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
Well, it's not true. I mean, some of the greatest, most horrific examples of environmental degradation have happened in these socialist economies. Chernobyl and things like that come to mind easily. But it's even more than that. I mean, if you look at North Korea, we didn't go in, but we could see it from not too far away. It's filthy. I mean, it's polluted in that sense of things. It's not clean. It's not healthy. You might have me on light pollution. I'm sure astronomers would just love North Korea, but in general, I think you'd not find. And I think there are a lot of academic papers. This gets dorky very quickly, but there are a lot of academic papers that look at environmental quality and the Economic Freedom Index, and they find that the more capitalist countries actually have better overall environments. And that's not to say that we've solved all of our environmental problems by any stretch, but
I'll double down even harder though. So Gaia doesn't have a utility function. So if we're measuring the environment as humans experience it, North Korea sucks. The way you experience the environment in Louisville with more carbon emissions and light is a way better environment than how a North Korean lives. And that how humans experience the environment is actually, I think, more important.
Just curious, I know in my travels I've been able to speak with people that lived under communist rule and then they didn't. Did you encounter any people, and what were those kind of conversations?
Yeah, we actually did a lot of interviewing, and unfortunately, a lot of that didn't make it into the book. And part of the problem was the interviews. We turned into economists again, and we started writing these up like very analytically, and we would write pages and pages of these interviews and these conversations with these. But it was like this is boring. Like this is exactly what we didn't want to do. Like that's what we normally do. And so most of that ended up on the cutting room floor. But we did in fact talk to lots of people. We had some very, like one of the things we kept noticing is that so many, in the Soviet Union, it seemed like every cab driver is a physicist or a mathematician. Because the Soviet Union overinvested in education. They produced mathematicians and physicists like mad, but there just aren't that many jobs for physicists and mathematicians. And so after the Soviet Union falls apart especially, like now they're driving taxi cabs. It's like you have the most overeducated taxi cab drivers on the planet. But a lot of that didn't make it in. It just wasn't. It became very. It sounded like we were doing journalism, but like hard journalism. We wanted to do. I don't know.
So to the idea of the question, though, I think, so what you see among older people who had, so particularly like mathematicians, physicists, they had privileged positions in the prior regime, and they have no marketable skills in a market economy. They've lost in transition and will be nostalgic for the old regime. And the fact that we think there's huge net benefits to moving to capitalism does not change that there's transitional losers, and that overeducated and unmarketable things older people in those regimes have lost, I think is definitely true. And that's where you get more of the nostalgia, much less from the young people.
Hey, thanks for being here. Thanks for coming to the classroom earlier today. I noticed in your all's speech over here, you said something about how China's kind of like cronyism. And I started to think about, in America, we subsidize a lot of interest, you know, and that there's candidates talking about trade restrictions and price ceilings. And I wondered if you were more afraid of a turn towards America turning more crony versus a turn towards socialism here, or are they kind of overlapping?
Yes. I'm concerned. I think Ben and I draw the very bright line in the book about socialism means the state, mostly the state ownership of the means of production. But the reality is it's a much fuzzier continuum. And there's no place that's ever had complete collectivization. There's no place that's had complete privatization. Every place has degrees of these. And you can effectively collectivize without actually taking title. So, like, for example, in the United States right now, in banking and finance, banking regulators literally work side by side inside of banks with the bank employees. You know, so the government has employees working side by side with at some point, you have to question, is this still a private bank, right? Now, it's nominally a private bank. It's listed on the stock exchange, you know, and so forth and so on. It looks like a private entity. But there's going to be a point where the regulatory state has consumed that entity so much that it's healthcare, finance is So we might have socialism in function without the name. You know, the Nazi Germany was a great example. Nazi Germany was socialist economy, but they never really took title. They didn't nationalize industries. They just sort of took them over, like by force. They simply said, "You guys are going to make tanks now and not cars," you know. And that was, they didn't take the company, they just co-opted the company. So it was still socialism, but it wasn't the socialism of the left type, like the Soviet type. So yeah, there's again, I don't know how far you get down that line before you start using the socialism word. Like, you know, it's not a bright line. We tried to make it as bright, for the purpose of the book, we wanted to make it as bright as possible. But in real life, outside of the context of the book, it's actually quite fuzzy.
So my name is Yusuf. So socialism sucks, but could you give a better definition to the people out here who don't know the difference between socialism, capitalism, and communism, and how communism was never been successful in practice, and countries that have tried to attempted to implement communism but kind of failed to do so?
All right, great question, and this is a term that there's lots of confusion about. So we've kind of said capitalism is private ownership of the major factors of production. Socialism is collective ownership, really government ownership. So where does communism fall in this? So people are used to thinking about the Soviet Union as being the communist country, but right, is Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So you have to, within Marx's system, we were going to go from capitalism to socialism. So in his progression, right, the proletariat were going to be more and more immiserated. There'd be fewer and fewer bourgeoisie. The proletariat would rise up and take over. They would nationalize the means of production, would be under state socialism. And then, after state socialism, we'd rationalize production, have higher output, and would end up in the land of milk and honey. The state would wither away and would end up in final communism. That was supposed to be the evolution. Now, of course, Marx's system doesn't work, so it doesn't happen like that, and no state ever withered away when it did it. So things that we use as a label of communism in in global economy, these countries would call themselves communism as an aspirational label within the Marxist system. But in practice, they were all state socialist enterprises. There is no communism in the real world in that sense. But the socialist communist terms, I think people get mixed up frequently.
Hello, good afternoon to you all. As a Cuban myself, born and raised in the island, I know pretty well how harmful this kind of system can be for a country, for a society. But I've been living in the US for 2.5 years now, and I'm planning to my future and my career and my whole life here. And I'm pretty interested in what you think or what you have to say about how the growing ideology in young people's mind about like this agreement with socialism, how harmful, or if you think it could be a threat in the future for the US. And in the future, I mean the next 10 or 20 years.
Well, I mean, we actually had a debate today. I don't even think we have an agreement amongst ourselves about how bad it really is. We have these polls, like Michael Moore's poll, about 40% of young people think socialism is a good idea. I don't know if it's clearly got me worse, but how bad is it? I don't know, so I don't know how much I should be worried about. I'm really not sure, to be sure. Part of it is the Chicago trip caused me to be weirdly less worried about the situation, because we ran into these people and we would ask them, like, do you think we should nationalize Walmart? And they're like, no, that's crazy. Who would want to do that? Like, well, okay, they're not that crazy. Like, they have concerns. Again, the racism, the sexism, the migrant rights, whatever it is. So they had concerns that we frequently agreed with, right? But they weren't really socialists. So I think a lot of times when people are answering these polls and we see these stories about, they like socialism, I'm not sure they really do, because I don't think they really know what it means. And I'm like, oh, this is good news. So I came away more optimistic after the Chicago trip, weirdly, because it was a little bit strange when people call you comrade. It feels weird. First time it happens to you, you're like, whoa.
You were wearing a red hat, man.
Yeah, I know, so that to me, that I'm not as crazy worried as I think I was, and I haven't really changed my view on that.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the Gen Zs are different than the millennials on the polling on this too, of not being quite so extreme.
Hello. So I'm from Panama, but I was born in Colombia, and I lived a few years in Colombia. And during the past elections from Venezuela, I was at different interviews from people voting for different sides, obviously a right side and a wrong side. And the people who were voting for Maduro, they were not well off, but they were like, oh, I have enough to survive, and I'm okay with it. And with the current Colombian president, he's trying to include a more socialism regime right now, and Colombians are not, for the most part, not okay with it, but they voted for that. So people who have lived under socialism, why do you think they still want to vote for that? Even though there's not a big amount, what do you think people still want that? Or like for Colombia, why did Colombians wanted to vote for socialism even though they have Venezuela right there?
I don't know if I can speak intelligently to Colombians' electoral preferences in this.
Or Venezuela. So if you were very, very poor in Venezuela, you get a ration card that keeps you alive. And it's the leftist socialist party that is, in charge. I can understand someone being reluctant to vote for the other guys, even though you can actually see the sort of chaos and degradation around you. I can sort of understand that. The flip side of that, though, is, people were told that if you don't vote for us, you're going to lose your ration card. So I'm not sure how authentic a lot of those votes are. if you're basically threatening people with the loss of their livelihood if they don't vote the right way, it's no surprise that they don't vote the other, that way. So it's hard to say. But I understand that. But most Venezuelans, I think, even the very poor, realize this is a bad system. It's working. Millions have left. It's, left the country. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, so going back to the question about Sweden, and it was brought up happiness index. And, economics, to me, it's a social science. It's not a hard science. I would think happiness index would be right in line with what you guys would study in economics. And I was just wondering, because in the end, it's probably not all about just economic wealth. In the end, it's about people enjoying life, like you talked about pollution. So I was just wondering why discount happiness index so quickly.
Because it's bullshit. So,
I like economics, but
so no. So listen, the idea is great. So utilitarianism would be the overall political philosophy on this, right? The greatest good for the greatest number. But the fundamental problem in utilitarianism is we can't measure utils and we can't compare them across people. So what do we do as economists? We measure efficiency, which is dollar value size of the pie. Now, why do we measure dollars instead of like number of shoes produced? Because there's some idea that dollars map into well-being of people. And there's roughly good reasons to think about this, but we also know it's not true. An extra dollar for Bill Gates is definitely not the same as an extra dollar to a poor Venezuelan. But how we measure listen, happiness is just a euphemism for utils. And we're going to pretend that when people say words, now we measure utils. This is a fundamental problem in philosophy since its inception, and we can't pretend that it's solved with happiness surveys. So these things are just silly. So instead, I would rather measure dollars and recognize the limitations. And also, as development economists, listen, most things correlate pretty well with dollars of the things we care about, of literacy rates, child mortality, life expectancy, go through all the development indicators. There's a strong correlation with dollar income. So why don't we actually measure shit that we can instead of just making stuff up?
I mean, there's a strong correlation with economic freedom and happiness. I mean, I share Ben's skepticism of happiness indexes, but if you look at the overall picture of things, there's not a great inconsistency there. But the problem is, asking people, talk is cheap. And you can say you're happy, you can say you're sad. But I can observe your behavior. I can observe if you've got a big house or a small house. I can observe if you've got a closet full of clothes or one pair of shoes to your name. These are things that I can observe and measure very well. And I think most of us like bigger houses over small houses, and most of us like more clothes over less clothes. So
we can watch people cross the Yalu River in one direction and not the other.
Yeah. So to most economists, kind of come down to, hey, talk is cheap. Let's look at people's behavior and measure the extent to which their behavior, and that seems to be where most economists are. There are plenty of people doing happiness studies, and they actually more or less back up my worldview, so they don't offend me as much as they offend Ben. But I also kind of think that like just asking people that question is kind of silly.
thank you.
Yeah.
I am going to forewarn you. I was here during the tail end of it, so I am sorry if this seems a little repetitive. But I would like to go back to the point you made with the lady in the blue dress about nostalgia. Do you think that could link to capitalist refusal to market save kind of thing?
I'm sorry, can you say, did you get that?
Expand a little bit on that, please?
When you were looking into personal behaviors and nostalgia, I was wondering if those personal behaviors, those nostalgia, and that experience could link to them not wanting to market to a younger crowd, kind of like gatekeeping of sorts. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. Maybe afterwards, can you come up and ask us?
So
yeah, of course.
This is
we might need to talk a little bit, figure out what.
The key was the nostalgia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Come back and see us.
All right, I think we got one more or two more, Steve.
Let's do two more.
Dos más.
All right.
Short.
Each one of us answers one.
Perfect. Well, good evening. Thank you for coming in today. My question relates to some term that people have been throwing around, like late stage capitalism, and that capitalism might not look like the good old days capitalism, that social mobility might be low, that profits are being sucked up somewhere, not things are not very transactional. What's your response to that capitalism doesn't look so much capitalistic? And what's your response to that?
I have two responses. So first of all, this goes to what Ben was talking about. In Marxist system, you have these sort of stages of history, this evolution of economic systems from feudalism to capitalism, and then if you want to add in late capitalism, and that's when things to Marxist theorists, that's when things really go to hell in a handbasket under capitalism, and that's what ushers in the state socialism and the collectivization of the means of production. So that late capitalism, a lot of Marxists are hoping for it, because if we get to late capitalism, then we're almost going to get to the socialism. That's the stages of things. I think that whole theory is just kind of insane. So I don't, there's nothing deterministic about the stages of, in fact, no country has ever gotten socialism the way Marx thought they were going to get it. They all got it differently. So that's what late capitalism means. It just means it's like when the capitalist system kind of finally goes maximum haywire, and the proletariat will eventually overthrow their capitalist oppressors. I don't see any merit in the term. The second answer, though, is we've weakened our capitalist systems greatly. The United States' economic freedom index is going down. It's going down in many other Western high-income nations. And we have what I would call creeping socialism, or creeping cronyism, at least. And a lot of the problems people are seeing, I think, are attributable to our weakening of capitalism, not this. And that's that's my view. So.
The most unaffordable sectors of the American economy that price lower class people out of it is healthcare, it's housing. These are some of the most highly regulated sectors of our economy where competition can't do what capitalism is supposed to. All right, I'll give a shorter answer than Bob to the last question so Steve can bring me to a bar.
Hi. I'm from Kentucky. I'm Ethan. One of the biggest critiques I hear on capitalism is the divide that it creates between the working and the owner class. So the top 1% of income earners own 30% of the wealth, and the bottom 50% only own 2.6%. Would you guys support raising the minimum wage to try and close that gap, or is it better to have a free market?
No. I told you I'd be quicker. So the little bit longer answer is raising the minimum wage would hurt more of the lower income workers than it would help them. And that what we should be doing is focusing on dynamics and making it a free to try economy where lower income workers can move up in the income chain and not be stuck where they are. And actually, I think raising the minimum wage would basically it's a barrier to entry for particularly minorities and younger people of getting experience in the labor market that lets them move up the ladder.
The other answer is that capitalist countries are not less equal than socialist countries. Also. Empirically, the premise that you have is that capitalism brings inequality. That premise is actually not true empirically. There's just simply no relationship between economic systems and inequality. There's a lot of inequality in the world, but it doesn't get worse when you go capitalist. And then you get rich, but you don't get more inequality.
All right, let's thank Bob and Ben for